Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Len Herstein, and welcome to this iteration of our Brand Managed Camp webinar series. For those of you who are not familiar, Brand Managed Camp is an annual brand marketing conference. We just had our 17th annual. I know a lot of you that are in attendance right now were out in Las Vegas with us for our 17th annual Brand Managed Camp a few weeks ago. Our next one will be in 2020, September 15th and 16th, back in Las Vegas. We're super excited. We're actually building the agenda right now, but every time we do build the agenda, we have so many more topics that we want to cover that we just don't have time to cover. So that's where these webinars come in, and we're just super excited for today's. Today's is called From Winning Presidential Campaign, excuse me, to Dominant Brands, the Essential Role of Brand Narratives. What we're going to be doing along the way, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. We're going to keep track of all those questions, and we're going to get to those at the end. I believe this presentation is about 40 minutes. So once we get to the end, I will then kind of take all the questions and pose them to our fantastic speakers, presenters, who I'm going to introduce right now. And then afterwards, a video will be available of this presentation that you can then go back to and watch. You'll get an email with that in the next day or so, with a link to the video, and then we'll have that posted so that you can share that with other folks or go back and look at specific slides if you want to. So I'm super excited. Today we've got two folks presenting with us. One is Joel Benenson. He's the founder and CEO of the Benenson Strategy Group, which is a strategic research and consulting firm. And he led the award-winning research and polling programs for President Obama's 2008 and 2012 campaigns. And he's the only Democratic pollster in history to have played a leading role in 3 winning presidential campaigns. So just fantastic amount of experience, and the stories he can tell and the things he's seen are amazing. But today he's going to be giving us a glimpse inside some of these campaigns to tell us, how this role of brand narratives comes to play and what that means for us as brand marketers. His co-presenter is Mitch Markle. He's a partner at Benenson Strategy Group. He's been a trusted advisor to heads of state, political leaders, Fortune 100 companies, and their CEOs, as well as leaders of major advocacy and nonprofit institutions. He's a classically trained opinion researcher and an expert in marketing strategy, brand communications, and targeting. For more than 20 years, Mitch has been utilizing cutting-edge methodologies to answer tough questions for companies, both large and small, and providing new levels of insight into their categories and audiences. And today, Joel and Mitch are going to be talking about, like I said, this essential role of brand narratives, and they're going to clarify what a narrative is, how successful ones are crafted, and they're going to discuss how narratives have been utilized in the political world, share some really cool examples, and give us some key lessons that we can take away to help us in our day-to-day work for brands and organizations. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mitch and Joel. Thanks for being with us today, guys.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for that introduction. This is Joel Benenson. I'm sitting here, as you heard, with Mitch Markle. So you'll hear a little difference in our voices, but we'll let you know when we're passing the baton to each other. Let me quickly tell you what we're going to cover here today on the agenda. You've already heard about us and our backgrounds. One thing that I do want to emphasize is that even though Benenson Strategy Group is known for its work in politics, that's where our public reputation sits. But most of the work we have done since our founding 20 years ago has been for clients in the corporate realm, and some of the most well-known and major brands, working on companies as diverse as Procter & Gamble, Toyota, McDonald's, etc. So we have spanned both realms, the political and the corporate. And so why, the question a lot of people might ask, we're going to cover why corporate marketers should learn from political campaigns. There are distinctions that we're very mindful of, but we're going to focus on why you should learn from them. Brand narratives, what are they from our perspective? What are they not, particularly how we see them in parallel between politics and for brands and companies like all of yours, and then how you get there, and we'll leave time for questions and answers at the end of this. And we're both native New Yorkers, so we'll talk quickly, which is what we're known for doing. I think we've already told you who we are here. Suffice it to say that we can go through any litany you want of the list of our clients, but I teed up a few just so you know, and Len did as well. But let's jump into the meat of this so we get as much time for questions as we can. And I want to start with the first item on the agenda, which is why should companies and brands learn from political campaigns? And I think there are certain things that are different, and there are many things that are similar. Winning political campaigns, in my view, are a paradigm for corporate branding and communications in a way. I think also campaigns learn from corporate marketers and brands along the way. One thing in the Obama campaign, we were the first campaign to use digital techniques in a very extensive way in 2007 and 8. Corporate marketers were ahead of us on that. We learned from them, we expand on it, and we develop our own techniques. So I think we see this as a symbiotic intersection, if you will, of the different areas of expertise we have at this firm, and I think they pay dividends both in the political world and in the marketing and communications world. And I think when you think about political campaigns, and particularly things that are very unique here, what do they really do? What do they deliver on? They have to tell a compelling story about the candidate. There, the brand is the candidate is the brand. This is all about the person. And when we talk about a compelling story, everything does have to ultimately lead to getting people to vote for that candidate. Just like in your world, everything has to get people to vote for your brand and choose that off the shelf when there are others sitting right next to it. In the world of politics, we really spend our time aligning around values to create more emotional connections with voters. People get inundated with a lot of policy talk. We believe very much in animating a candidate's values, what they believe in, what are the principles they stand for. And the candidates that do best in the world of politics are those that communicate that clearly and link that to what they say they're going to do for you or what they've done in the past to create those emotional connections with voters. So, you have to tell people why you're fighting. You have to talk about your values. And I think in politics, values are more important than policies. And we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. And I think for brands, that's becoming more and more true. Candidates have to be authentic. The connections they make with voters have to be true to the candidate's DNA. We live in a world today where it is much easier for voters to see through BS, if you will, to detect things that don't seem authentic, that don't seem really true to a candidate. And the things that can undermine a candidate and a brand the most are those things that come across as false or phony or not honest and truthful with voters. And I think that's becoming more and more true in the world of brands. In politics, I have always preached, and I think I'm right on this point, that strategy will always trump tactics. And it doesn't mean that you don't need tactics from time to time. But I think, and I've seen a lot of brands that get a whole lot more tactical than strategic, and that tends to be when they lose oxygen rather than gain oxygen. But you really, even though you need tactics in both realms, you never want to let them overtake your strategy. Your tactics have to be in service of your strategy and consistent with those values that I talked about. Lastly, I think in political campaigns, we always have I call them defined rules of the road and guardrails. You have to know where you can't go off track. You have to know where you can't run off the road. And I think it's important for that because we're competing in a world of voters who are accessible to us. We call them swing voters usually. We know that we're in a very partisan world now, but there are always voters who are accessible, who could actually go either way. Swing voters do truly exist. It's why Democrats in 2018 were able to take back the House with a massive sweep of seats 2 years after losing the presidential election. And I think brands also have to think about competing for consumers who are accessible to them more. And how do you reach them and make those connections? And I think, neither candidates nor brands ever get 100% of market share. And winning doesn't take getting 100% of market share. It does take getting the maximum number of voters who are accessible to you to sign on with you. So let's talk about why we're here today, which is the subject at hand, which is talk about brand narratives. So from our perspective, let's talk about what a brand narrative is. We say a narrative is the durable story you tell about yourself or your brand that is rooted in your values. And I think that the story you tell about yourself, what I mean by that in the simplest language, it shows others who you are, it shows others what you stand for, and it shows others what you aspire to be. And, you know, what you aspire to be, if that sounds like a lot of what you do with a brand, it's because it is. I think there's a real parallel here about what a narrative should be that can go to work for big brands in particular, but brands that are in competitive situations as well. Let me be very clear about what a narrative is not. And I think there's a lot of interchangeable use of these words, but a narrative is not messaging. They're two different things. I said the narrative is the durable story you tell about yourself. It doesn't mean it's immutable, but it largely is. But messaging is much more situational. It's about how you adapt your narrative to different situations. You may be facing as a brand very positive situations one day, reactive situations the next. At the most problematic, you might be facing a crisis, and we've done work in all three of these areas for the brands that we've worked in over the years. So your messaging grows out of your narrative. They're not separate and distinct. They are interrelated and have to work together. The messaging, though, is how you really animate your strategy. It's how you communicate your customer proposition. It's how you manage short-term situations. Your messaging. Did I say narrative on the last one? I think I did. It's not your brand story. A narrative is more than that. A brand story is your biography. It's what you want people to know about and why. It's about how you got to where you are. It shows where your values come from. It humanizes your company. It's a much more detailed story. And I think for a lot of brands also, if you've ever worked on one of these brands that have done these exercises, sometimes your origin story is the most important story you tell. And that's your biography. That's the equivalent of what a politician does with his or her story. But it's got to be rooted in an authentic story and authentic values that show where you come from and how you got to where you are today. And that's what your brand story is. It's a piece of your narrative, but it's not the whole ball of wax. And I think, you know, in the world of politics, you know, we're often in a realm that's more competitive than that those of you have to deal with every day. Our business can get pretty nasty day in and day out. We're living through some pretty turbulent times, no matter what your perspective is today. But successful politicians ultimately rely on a brand narrative because it relates to authenticity. In the world of politics, it's even more important for a candidate to have a narrative that's rooted in their values and becomes something that he or she can stand for, because it guides their whole campaign. It's home base in a way that you can put it to work for you every day in every situation. In an age when it gets harder and harder for candidates to demonstrate true authenticity, they need brand narratives so that their whole staff can also stay true to the message, so that it can drive the whole campaign. That's why narratives have an absolutely intrinsic value to political campaigns today. And you might ask, from where you folks sit, why do candidates need a, quote, brand narrative? And, you know, I think some politicians recoil at the word brand, but those who are successful actually do think of a brand. And if you think of what a brand says, it says to everybody in the organization how you have to behave, how you have to think about your product on the marketing side. We don't think of a candidate as the product, but we think of the candidate as the epicenter of any campaign we're in. Sometimes we're talking about issue-oriented campaigns where the cause is at the epicenter of it. But when you're in a political campaign, I've always said to candidates, who you are as a person is going to come through. There are other people who are my peers and my colleagues in these campaigns who would describe a presidential campaign as an MRI for your soul. You cannot con the American people when you're out in front of them day in and day out. And so a narrative animates and brings to life your story, your values, to the voters that you're trying to persuade every day. And that's value and important piece number one. The second thing is that a narrative allows candidates to balance both the customization that you have to have and authenticity and consistency that you have to demonstrate every way. And when I say balance this, you're in different situations. You don't want to become someone who is telling a different story every day. The media environment we live in won't let you do that. You'll get held accountable for that. So it's essential in modern campaigns, when communicating in multiple spheres and different audiences simultaneously here, that the narrative becomes unifying, that it becomes the core and the essence of the story you tell. And the same is true for brands now. Consumers have more ability to pick apart, find everything you say about yourself, and judge on their terms and their perspective whether or not you're being authentic and true to what you say you're going to do for them and interact with them every day. I think the daily competition that we face in political campaigns requires a discipline that can only come from having a strong narrative. And the reason I say that is these campaigns are growing bigger, not smaller, in the number of people and the number of ways you're reaching out to voters in the world of politics. And that means that the brand narrative has to be clarifying and directive for everybody working on that campaign, from the person who's knocking on doors up to the communications director who's traveling with the candidate, or the rapid response person who's dealing with the exigencies of every day back in campaign headquarters. You can only have that discipline if you have a strong narrative, because the media and the opposition are constantly trying to create a different narrative about you. Fourth, politicians start out facing strong skepticism, probably more than most of your brands do, although I think you'd all say consumers are getting a lot more discerning and a lot more difficult, and they're making a lot more demands on you to prove that you are what you say you are as a product or as a service, right? And if you face the kind of skepticism that politicians do, the process of developing those emotional connections is critical, because they have to be durable. They have to be, again, real. And they're not easy to establish in a world where you're getting bombarded with a lot of information about not just your candidate, not just yourself, but a lot of other candidates now, and the cacophony of noise that takes place in the multiple media outlets that voters have to consume every day. So the only way you can create that strong emotional connection is through the values, the strong values that you bring to your table that are really shared values by a large pool of voters or the communities that you're trying to persuade. And the last point here is about the narrative, when well executed and designed, really provides the clear rules of the road and guardrails to shape the campaign strategy and the tactics and the behaviors of people in it. I think the Obama campaign, which I will mention more than most, is because it was uniquely built on a very strong narrative and a very strong set of values that embodied the candidate's values. And the larger campaign gets, the more people are having input and creative outputs, the more important it is that everyone knows the rules of the road. And it's as important as it is for everyone, on the campaign, to know the rules of the road, what you cannot do, because your actions reflect on the candidate every day. So knowing those rules of the road in a campaign for everyone is as important as the drivers of cars knowing the rules of the road. There's this mutual set of rules that we all live by. And when you stray from them, if you do, and your candidate is on top of it, you're going to hear about it, because if you betray those values, you end up betraying the candidate, and the same is true in a brand setting. So as I said earlier, I summarized the point about narratives and, what the composition of that is. And, I said at the essence of this is your narrative is about who you are, what you stand for, what you aspire to be. And when Mitch and I were talking about this, Mitch said, let's go back and look at Obama's announcement speech in February 2007, and let's see if it really comes off the page. So with all apologies to Barack Obama, because I don't have his deep baritone voice, let me just read through some of this, right? If you look right in the first paragraph here, right? I came to understand that our cherished rights of liberty and equality depend on the active participation of an awakened electorate. This was a core value of Obama's, an awakened electorate, that we had to expand participation because he believed it was the way we protected rights and liberties. And these don't flow one sentence from the other, but in the next graph, the core values here, which you may remember or may not. He was in Springfield, Illinois, where he'd been a state senator, and he said it was here where we learned to disagree without being disagreeable, value number one. Two, that it's possible to compromise, so as long as you know those principles that can never be compromised, right? Compromise is an essential ingredient of democracy, he was saying, but not on principles that you can never compromise on. And three, and that as so long as we're willing to listen to each other, we can assume the best in people instead of the worst. And he was so right then, and we are at a point now that we're having more and more trouble listening to each other, which was one of the strengths he brought to the table. The next bullet, it's bolded there for you, that in the face of impossible odds, people who love their country can change it. Look, it was understandably a campaign about change from every moment. But here was this guy with, as he would acknowledge, a funny name, but as a Democrat, as somebody who looked different, who was younger, who had this name, demonstrating love of country. It was not only something that we felt we had to do as a campaign, but he was issuing a very strong call to action. It was deliberate, it was directive, that in the face of impossible odds, if you love this country, we can change it. And he included everybody in it. Let be the generation that makes future generations proud. And that's why the campaign can't only be about me, it must be about us, to push us forward when we're doing right and let us know when we're not. That's where he's talking about who we are. If you go back to the beginning here, I said a narrative has to be about who you are, what you stand for, and what you aspire to be. And if you look at this page simply, you see that Barack Obama in February of 2007 captured all of that and put it forward at the very start of his campaign, his announcement speech in Springfield, Illinois. I'm going to pass it over to Mitch.
So, look, I think Joel did a great job of talking about what narratives are, especially on the political campaign side, how politicians and candidates use them to help tell their story. But importantly, and the reason why we're here today is because narratives are not just for political campaigns and for candidates. The truth is every type of organization can benefit from having one, whether you're a major corporation, you're a nonprofit, you're an advocacy group that's promoting an issue or a cause. Charities and foundations use and rely on narratives a lot, and other types of institutional clients that we work with. For the rest of today, we're going to focus on corporations, but the reality is how we go about helping develop brand narratives for our political clients, for our corporate clients. The process that we go through are the same for all of these types of entities. I think it's important before we get into the crux of this, as Joel mentioned before, narratives are not messaging and narratives are not brand story. I don't want to necessarily say that brand narratives are something that's new to marketers, but I certainly believe that they are becoming more critical than they ever have before. In the past, traditional marketing, you were in control of the brand, and Joel alluded a little bit to this before. Positioning statements were what helped consumers understand why you were relevant to them, why they should buy your product. Mission statements were used to help explain where you were going and what your vision was. Paid communications were a way to offer both of those. But in today's world, companies are less in control of their brand than ever before. Joel talked about this before. Social media now gives others a voice about who you are, right? And allows them to talk about your brand and provide the narrative. Digital media allows news, particularly bad news, to spread very, very quickly. Multi-channel marketing making it harder for consistency in message. And then new competitors are coming in to disrupt your category and reposition it. All of this means that a strong brand narrative is going to help ensure that others are thinking about you the way that you want them, to do, especially through all the clutter before. So when clients come to me and say, okay, but why do I need a brand narrative? What is a brand narrative? How is that different than a positioning statement or a missioning statement? This is sort of the way that I want them to think about it, right? That it's different in the sense that you have to tell people the story that you want them to be telling about yourself. In essence, narratives expose your values, right? So that everyone, whether they're inside or outside of your organization, can see them. Importantly, it's what you want your values exposed. You want all of your stakeholders to know what you stand for. A narrative essentially becomes the mechanism, right? The pathway for how you're going to communicate your values in everything that you do, whether it's through your ultimate marketing strategy, whether it's through messaging, the offer that you're providing, your product, your service. Internally, very importantly, your employee communications so that your employees understand who you are and what you stand for, the communities that you're operating in, and all of your external stakeholders, right? A value or a narrative rather is how, like Joel said, it's essentially how you're animating or bringing to life your values for all of these different stakeholders and all of these different marketing initiatives that you have. So why a strong narrative? What's the benefit of having a strong narrative? First, consumers will trust and respect you beyond just the product and the service that you're offering. Essentially, it's telling consumers who you are so that they feel this deeper emotional connection that Joel was talking about on politics. They feel the same way on your brand and your companies, and this exists past just the functional relationship that you're going to have with them. And that in and of itself is extremely important for a lot of obvious reasons and some other reasons, which I'll get into in just a few seconds. Two, it provides those guardrails and those internal rules to live by for your messaging and for your marketing. Essentially, it informs everyone throughout the organization what is and what is not acceptable to do or say. And importantly, right, most companies have a set of values, right? We see this all the time. We go into buildings, they're hanging on the wall. You go to their website, you can see them. But the reality is many, I'm not going to say most, I'm not going to say all, but many of these companies really just treat them like words on a paper. They rarely revisit them. They really are ensuring that they guide decisions. Joel and I still to this day talk about a pitch that we went on several years ago to do some internal corporate culture work. And as in advance of the pitch is sort of our setup for it, we looked at their values, and they had 10 values listed on the website, and number 10 was ethics and integrity come first. And we kind of joked, and we brought it up at the pitch. You're saying ethics and integrity come first, yet it's number 10 on your list of values. And not surprising, that company did not survive some of the challenges that they were facing. So it can't be just words on a paper, right? And what a narrative does is it makes sure that your values are living within the organization, what you're doing. Number 3, it serves as a home base when facing challenges or a crisis. A strong brand narrative, it keeps you on track. It makes sure that you are continuing to be true to yourself and what got you to where you were. And keep in mind, right, when a significant challenge or a crisis arises, that is never the time for improvisation. The more you improvise, the greater the chance that you're going to make a mistake, that you're going to lose the argument. Having a strong brand narrative serves as that anchor, right? That thing that you could always go back to revisit who we are, what are we supposed to say, who we are, what are we showing for, what do we aspire to be, right? Those 3 things that we talked about before, particularly when you're facing a challenge or a crisis. Number 4, obviously a strong brand narrative is going to be helpful in attracting and inspiring your employees. Employees, as we all know, are your most valuable asset. A strong narrative ensures that you're attracting employees that are going to share in your values and want to contribute to what you're trying to do, what those things you aspire to be. And it's going to inspire these employees every day so that they remain focused and also focused on the bigger picture. And then finally, a strong brand narrative will also create and strengthen the emotional connection that you have with other external audiences. So similar to number one, where it gives consumers a reason to believe in your brand and trust your brand beyond just the product and service. When it comes to external audiences, whether these are your suppliers, your partners, peer executives, community leaders, could be media, could even be Wall Street, or anyone else that you're interacting with, the more they know about you and your values, the more that they're going to believe that you live by those values, or the more that they believe that you live by those values, the stronger relationship you're going to have with them. And this means credibility when you're communicating and advocating with them the most.
If you think of the way we know how even the most loyal consumers react when they feel that a product that they've come to rely on lets them down, that's very problematic. And you might get 1 second chance, but you won't get 2 second chances or a third chance. The same is true. This is why the narrative is so important, is because it really makes sure that you don't let consumers down on either the product side or the values and the emotional side. And this is particularly important, as I'm sure you all know, with younger generations of consumers who are valuing those things, those character dimensions more and more on your brand.
So I hear from my clients a lot, well, Mitch, we already have a brand narrative, or I think we have a brand narrative. And we've done a lot of work developing our position. We went out, we did all, this research to develop our core messages, hire a brand agency to help us communicate our brand. So we don't need a brand narrative, but we already have a brand narrative. And I usually start them by asking them a few questions, right? And I always say, first and foremost, well, do you believe that your consumers actually know what you stand for besides your offering, right? They always come back and they talk about, yeah, well, they know we make this product. We know that we deliver this service. We do this better. We do that better than the competition. And I push back. Okay, but do your consumers really know what your values are? Do you think that they can talk about your type of company or the type of company you are and the things that you care about without mentioning your core product? If they can't say anything about you other than the product or the service that you're offering them, then they don't know enough about you and they don't know what you stand for besides your offering. So you may not actually have a brand narrative. The second question I ask, and I frame it the same way, but I do it about your employees. Do you believe that your employees know what you stand for besides your offering? And here, I almost always hear, yes, of course they do. And then what happens is I typically go and I talk to actual employees. And that's when I hear things like, well, yeah, we're trying to make money. We're trying to be profitable for our shareholders. We're trying to make the best X, the best widget in the business. Really, do I actually hear things about the company's values and what you stand for, and the things that you care more about than just making the product, making the product. So I sort of then go back to my client and say, okay, you think you know what you think your employees know what you stand for, but the reality is they're either talking very differently than you are. They're saying multiple things, which happens a lot. You talk to 5 different employees, you hear 5 different things. And it kind of speaks to the fact that employees don't always really know what your brand narrative is. Then I say, do employees know what lines can never be crossed? This gets to the guardrails that we were talking about. Do your employees have a clear understanding of how to act and what is and what is not appropriate when it comes to decision making? Do they know the lines that they can't cross? Do they know things that they can't say? Do they know avenues that they can't sort of go down? And sometimes the answer is yes, and it's very clear, and we have mechanisms in place and guardrails already in line. But a lot of times when companies go through crisis, when you do your debrief afterwards to figure out, well, what happened and why, it usually comes down to some decision that was made by somebody who didn't understand what those guardrails were. Fourth, I say, do you have credibility when you're entering a new line of business or responding to an attack or a crisis? If people can trust you and what you're saying, particularly when under scrutiny, if people can't trust you and what you're saying, particularly when you're under scrutiny, then your messaging is going to fall flat. People will not believe the things that you're saying. They won't believe that you're taking this seriously or that you have the fix in place. They won't believe that you have, or they won't give you the credibility to start talking about a new offering or a new service or some new area that you want to play in. You want to make sure that people listen to you when you talk and that they believe the things that you're saying. A strong narrative helps ensure that you're building that trust and that credibility. And then finally, do you have partners that are going to advocate for you, particularly in times of need? If you have a strong narrative that speaks to your true self and your values, then others are going to be more willing to speak on your behalf. Again, these are questions that I often ask companies. They think they know the answer to, but they actually require the real deep dive into who you are.
want to add one point about that fourth bullet, that you have credibility when entering new lines of business, but also when you're responding to attacks or a crisis. A crisis, something going wrong with one of your products, is never the time where you should be figuring out how you're going to respond to that. What a narrative does, because it's rooted in your durable values, right, and your durable story, it should immediately inform everyone in the organization from top to bottom about how to respond to that crisis in a credible, believable way that lets you address it looking backwards, but also identify how you're going to correct things going forward.
Let me give a quick case study here. Joel gave the Barack Obama campaign speech that he gave when he was entering the presidential campaign. Let me talk about something that we did for Toyota and helping them develop essentially a brand narrative for them. Now, this came from work coming out of 2010, which obviously is almost a decade ago, but I think it's very, very relevant for why a brand narrative is so important. We were instrumental in helping Toyota manage through their crisis of 2010. And then building or rebuilding their trust and their corporate reputation coming out of it. But by the end of 2010, Akio Toyoda, who was the CEO, realized that the company needed a global brand narrative. Now, this was unprecedented for this company because this company always viewed things very regionally based. And he understood that having a global brand narrative, something that was consistent across all markets, would help prevent some of the issues that happened to them before, not just the functional elements of the crisis itself, but in how they had to respond to it and where they were starting from. And very, very importantly, his instructions to us basically were, you can change anything you want about what Toyota is or how we talk about ourselves, except our values. These values were set by my grandfather when he started the company. You cannot change the values that Toyota had. And that was a very clear direction for us and the team that was working on this narrative. We can change their mission, we can change the value proposition, we can change the messaging, if you will, about Toyota, but in developing this narrative, we had to remain true to the values of the company. We obviously have been doing a lot of research on their behalf. We went out, we did some more research, and there were 4 key things that we were hearing from consumers about their values, despite all the negative news that was surrounding them. Toyota was still seen as a company that wanted to enhance the life of individuals everywhere. They wanted to create and develop advanced technologies to provide outstanding products that fulfill people's needs. They wanted to instill harmony with the global community, and they wanted to work with business partners to achieve long-term growth, and that they were open to all and new partnerships. Now, a couple of things. Now, these were sort of their values, and we sort of validated that they still existed. You'll notice that in their values, there was nothing about cars or vehicles, and that was important for the narrative. But these were all things that, despite the negative news that was out there and all the issues that they were having, was still true. Consumers and their business partners and everybody else we spoke to within and outside of the organization still believe these 4 things about Toyota. So what that resulted in was essentially a Toyota narrative, and I bolded some key things here because it speaks to their values. But essentially, the narrative that was developed, Toyota will continue its long history of innovation to enhance the world and its citizens by developing new products and new services that will impact the future. Toyota will lead the future of mobility, enriching lives around the world with the safest and most responsible ways of moving people. Through our commitment to quality, ceaseless innovation, and respect for the planet, we strive to exceed expectations and be rewarded with a smile. We will meet this challenge goal by engaging with talent and passion of people who believe there is always a better way. Now, again, this narrative was fairly short, but it was simple and it was important. It was a narrative that everybody in the company around the world has since adopted and follows. And if you notice, again, I'll mention it again, the word cars does not appear here anywhere. In a world of innovation and technology, Toyota knew that they needed to be thinking about mobility. And this was about not even just getting people from place to place, but actually helping people move around, whatever that meant. And coming out of that, employees had permission to start to look at different avenues. Toyota has done a lot of work helping the handicapped within their own homes move around, reach shelves, things like that. They have a new technology that helps blind people get around their homes and get around public spaces. They're doing a lot of things in communities, helping seniors and people that don't drive, don't have access to vehicles, get them to their appointments. They're partnering with other companies like Ubers, like public transportation companies, to help people get from where they need to be or help people with their mobility. And all of that comes out of this Toyota narrative that was built off of an understanding of who they're, or what they were, right, their values, and the things that they inspired to be.
So, I'm going to do my New Yorker bit here and go as fast as I can so we can get to your questions quickly. Developing the narrative. So let's be clear. It's harder than developing a message. I think we've explained why. You will still use messaging and you'll still deal in situations, but the narrative has to be durable. It's what actually liberates you to be able to message in any situation, and it's long lasting and it will improve your messaging over the long run. A narrative also really should be the most consumer oriented work you do, and then some. Narratives really require a deep dive into your own ecosystem, not just your consumer mindset. You have to also understand your own origin and culture. You have to understand your consumers at a deeper level, understand their values, understand what are their roots of attachment to your brand. And you also have to understand your category and the competitors. So you're not only mapping the competitive landscape, you're mapping the mindset of your audiences internally and externally. How do we do it? We have a process that we've put to work here over the last several years, many years. We start with you. We start with your brand. We don't presume to know everything, but we also ask many questions that often people say, gee, we've never thought of asking that question before. So we do an internal audit of existing research and materials, including internal and external communications. We do executive and partner IDIs. We'll talk to suppliers. We'll talk to distributors as well. We have a technique that we've developed here and we've used very successfully over almost the last, I'd say, 8 years now. It's called ethnojournaling. It's the most impactful qualitative research I've ever seen in 25 years as a researcher. They're done with your core audiences. They go deep into their hearts and minds and understand their values and relationship with you. These are all done online. People are given time to answer complex questions. We're not looking for top of mind answers. We're looking for going in depth. I will give you one example. We recently did one on divisiveness in America. For a client, we did 40 interviews. We had 40 interviewees over 4 nights. They produced 900 pages of transcripts. And we read through all those journals and synthesize that qualitative data. It is far deeper than any focus group I've ever seen done or set of focus groups I've ever seen done. I mentioned before, we do a quantitative mindset mapping. We take that qualitative data and we really use it to inform our quantitative survey so that we can map the framework and the landscape that you are operating in. We said all of this narrative development is rooted in the durable story of your values, but you also have to connect with the mindset and the values of your audiences. So we do the mindset mapping, understand their pain points, and then we do values mapping, where we're overlaying your values with your consumers to identify alignments and opportunities, and of course, see where there might be gaps as well. Does your language that you're using communicate what you think it means to your consumers or not? And then lastly, we call it DNA testing. Do consumers see you the same way you see yourself? So these 5 steps, they're not all 5 distinct research steps, but they inform how we get to the core narrative. And what is the out product of this, the end product from BSG? You get the narrative itself. We do the map of the mindset for you, and that's the deep dive analysis. You have that. We give you your values pillars. We really want to cull those down. You can't have too many, because if you have too many values, you actually have no values. And we really try to focus on demonstrating to you how they work together and serve your ultimate North Star. We help with messaging. We build out messaging to build out the value pillars so they're not, they're spoken in colloquial language and connect the narrative more directly to the product, the issue, the brand, or the company. And lastly, we give you a set of do's and don'ts on the language.
Let me just, in the last 2 seconds, just show you a quick couple of examples of what some of these outputs look like. Again, we talked about the language do's and don'ts, the mindset mapping, but I think importantly, for a lot of clients, we actually develop handbooks, right? So these are multiple pages. This is an example of one that we did for a client. It was about a 30 or 40 page. I just took a handful of pages here. But we'll actually put together and produce actual books that then sit on everybody's shelves and desks so that they could always go back to what their narrative is and what it means for them and all of those other things that Joel just sort of talked about.
Those books will include how to deal with difficult situations, certain challenges that crop up. We anticipate those kinds of things. So it really is a roadmap. And then we obviously, when we do those for clients, we work with them on a regular basis to make sure they're staying true to the narrative.
Awesome. Well, guys, there's so much to think about here. I appreciate everything you shared with us, the perspective that you shared with us. I just launched a poll for folks who are online right now as to whether you currently feel like your organization has a well-developed and effective brand narrative. We're just trying to get an idea for what the prevalence is out there in the little microcosm of the universe that we're talking to right now. So go ahead and answer that. Also, if you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask those questions, and we'll either answer them live, or if it's something very, very specific to you, we can have the guys answer you afterwards. So what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to kick off with some of the questions that we've got, and then we'll go for a few minutes here, and then like I said, for anybody who does have to leave, this recording will be available. You'll get an email with a link to where you can view that recording and share it with other people. And the guys, both Joel and Mitch's contact information are on the screen right now. So you can always reach out to them directly afterwards with questions that you might have or any follow-ups. So guys, one of the questions that has come up is, we talk about what's going on in politics today. And one of the things, and again, without being partisan in any way, but I think we can all agree that there's a lot of divisiveness going on. And there's, it seems like there's a lot of definition of candidates and definition of parties based on what they're not, right? So, defining themselves by, I'm not a Republican, or I'm not a Democrat, or I don't believe this, or I don't believe that. And so, I think, if, having something to put yourself up against, to define yourself against as to what you're not, right? And, I think a good example of that probably from branding from several years ago is kind of the Apple PC, the Mac PC argument, where they made it very, very obvious that, if you're Apple, you're cool and hip, and if you're Mac, if you're PC, you are awkward and maybe a little creepy, right? And that's this defining who you are by who you're not. Do you see that as something that is becoming more prevalent, that has relevance to brands who maybe in the past have tried to be kind of everything to everybody, or are afraid of for lack of a better word, pissing anybody off? What do you think the relevance of that is, and do you think that is sustainable and is something that should be emulated?
I hate to disagree with my host. This is Joel. But since you brought up the Apple argument, it's something that I know about because I've done talks around this very issue. And it's the antithesis of what you said. Apple was not defining itself in opposition to Microsoft. In 1998, I just want you all to know, in an article in Vanity Fair, Bill Gates was quoted as saying, "I don't think I can ever envision a time when Apple will be bigger or more profitable than Microsoft." 1998. In that same article, he said, "I think Steve is playing a losing hand and he knows it." But what Jobs knew, Bill Gates was still talking about a computer on every desktop. That was Microsoft's theme. What Jobs believed was two very distinct things: that the world was going mobile and that beauty mattered. And he built Apple around that. Nothing could be more of an affirmative vision than that was. He wasn't positioning himself against Microsoft. He just had a very different vision from Bill Gates, and it turned out he was right. The world did go mobile. And if you go back, I encourage everybody after this, go watch the very first iPod ad, which had a guy sitting at his Mac playing music, right? That he then puts in his folder, puts his little iPod in his pocket, kind of nerdy looking guy, dances out towards his front door, stops before the front door, and it says on the screen, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And then think different. That's all it said. And that was what Jobs was about. He was about seeing a different vision. And I think, if anything, he had a brand narrative that was actually more durably rooted in a set of values than Gates did at the time. Remember, that was when they were also facing 98 antitrust hearings. I think both have proved to be very strong companies, and they've survived because I think they both have very strong visions and narratives about what they are going to provide over the long term. I think Microsoft adjusted after the antitrust trial, and Apple has never strayed.
Well, first of all, you should never apologize for disagreeing with me, because I'm usually wrong. And that's a good bet to disagree with me at most points in time. But moving into where we are today, would you also disagree that, I mean, do you also believe that this idea of divisiveness and this idea of taking a stand based on what you're not as opposed to what you are is creeping into society a bit, or no?
Look, I think it's always been there a bit. I mean, you could go back to the early days of, and if I'm dating myself here, I apologize, of the competition between Avis and Hertz. And Hertz was the big player. They were the big, leader in the category. And Avis positioned themselves a little bit at the smaller guy who was trying harder. And they said, Avis, we're number two. We try harder. They owned being number two. And yeah, they were pushing off against the category leader because Hertz was so dominant. And I'm giving you a situational paradigm, but it was also, they were positioning themselves as the more service-oriented company at that time. So I think it's been there for a while, but I still think that brands and narratives that work have to be affirmative. If they're the durable story you tell that are rooted in your values. I have never seen a successful brand whose values aren't rooted in what they stand for, in their origin story. And I don't think that we're really pushing off against each other more. I think the world is more competitive. And I think there are some categories where brands can go, look, Coke and Pepsi, we had the soda wars forever, right? But I don't think it's a new dynamic, but I also think it's still a very limited dynamic. I think there are some cases where you can define yourself by being not what your competitor is, or what your target is, particularly when you're not the number one player in the category. But the number one player in the category is never, I worked for a politician named Mario Cuomo. He once said, you never see the guy in the Western turning around on their horse and shooting at the guy behind him. You just keep riding your horse as fast as you can. Mitch is going to talk about a good, yeah.
So I think to that point, I think IKEA is a great example of a...
Hey, Mitch, if you can get closer to the microphone, that'd be great.
Sure, sorry. I think IKEA is a great example of a company that defines themselves by what they're not and pushing off against the competition, right? So if you think about what IKEA is, their showroom, their buying experience is vastly different than any other way that you would buy furniture. They understood that setting up fancy couches and fancy chairs in fake settings is not what people want. It does not help them actually decide what piece of furniture they want. So they went to the bare bones mechanism. We're going to offer you cheap furniture that you don't feel bad about buying. If it doesn't work, you don't feel bad about getting rid of it or replacing it. They created a showroom experience where you can see things in different settings. They exemplify in some of their rooms how different layouts could work. They give you all of their options so you can actually sit and feel them in real time. You're not just looking through a catalog or a showroom. So that's a great example, I think, of a company that took what they're not and used it to an advantage.
Right. No, I think those are great examples. I think, another thing, if we're talking about, I think there's some also great examples of companies and brands that are rivals who are playing really nicely together. I mean, I think recently there was a great example of I believe it was Burger King who stopped selling their Whopper for a day to support McDonald's, support of a cause that they were doing through sales of their Big Macs, which is something that if you can think of two bigger rivals other than Coke and Pepsi back in the day, there probably aren't in the brand world, and seeing them coordinate and work together is nice. So I think you're right. I think positive is always going to win over negative. We have a question. Someone is interested in learning a little bit more about kind of developing what an ethno-journal really is. I think there's maybe just a little bit of confusion. Can you just give a brief kind of description of what exactly an ethno-journal is?
Yeah, I'm a former journalist, and I grew up in technique studies as a reporter, just going around the state of New York once talking to real people and finding that I discovered things that were contradictory to what a lot of assumptions I had were about a particular election. So what we do is each night we design to be devoted to a particular topic. Usually we try to stay to one topic. We recruit an audience of people who will participate online anywhere from 4 to 6 evenings. They're told that they will get a series of questions, and they have 24 to 48 hours sometimes to answer that series of questions. So they can do it at their convenience. But every question, instead of being like a focus group where you want top of mind answers and you write a question and you want to see what they say off the top of their head, our questions are really multifaceted. If you think of a focus group question with all the probes you might have that you're going to back it up with so that you get a longer conversation in the group, we kind of embed those as in one question. We want people to think deeply. So for example, we used these for President Obama in 2011, in the wake of the economic crisis. An example of one question on the night we worked on the workplace would have been, tell us the last time you were treated unfairly in the workplace. Describe in detail what happened. Please tell me why you thought you were treated unfairly in that situation. How would you have liked to have been treated? And how was this similar or different from other ways you were treated recently in the workplace? So the goal of this is to go much more deeper into their lives, let them talk. What you will see is that people right now in America are desperate to be listened to and to be heard. And as I mentioned, in that first time we put this to work in a presidential campaign was 2011, and we worked with 100 swing voters over 6 nights. We had 1,400 pages of transcripts. And it gave us more insight into their economic lives post-crisis than any poll or any focus group had given us. We had a 360-degree view of what adjustments they were making. And it's done on an individual basis, so they're answering in their own home. You don't get the group dynamic there. We used to follow them up with some focus groups with some people. We don't even do that anymore, because even when we follow it up with groups, we would do triads. You can never get as rich data as you can in these hundreds of pages. And it's a bit of an anthropological study, which is why we call them ethno-journaling. It is like ethnographic work, only because we have to read through all these journals and synthesize the data. So it's the most extensive and the most dynamic qualitative research I've seen in 25 years as a researcher.
Great, thank you. So we've got just a couple minutes here. We're gonna close. I've got a couple of questions here that I'm gonna combine, and I just want to give a quick update on the poll that we did. And it looks like right now, it looks like 26% of the folks who answered feel like their organization currently has a well-developed and effective brand narrative. 37% do not feel like their organization currently has one, and another 37% are unsure. And I would probably venture to guess that if you're unsure, you probably don't have a well-developed and effective brand narrative by definition. So it's interesting, and I think that kind of leads to these last 2 questions here that I'm going to combine that we can answer quickly, and then we can always follow up afterwards. I think people are seeing how this works for politics. They see how it works for big brands and big consumer brands. But so the 2 questions that are out here are: do you have an example of a nonprofit successfully implementing a narrative and subsequent messaging? And another one, the other question is: how do you build a brand narrative for a seemingly uninteresting company such as B2B commodity manufacturers? So I think there's some folks maybe in the audience who are seeing the benefits, seeing how it works in certain situations, but maybe having a hard time translating that into their world that they might perceive as a little bit different or a little bit less sexy than some of the other things.
Sure. So this is Mitch. So to answer the first question of have we done them for nonprofits and other sort of institutions and organizations, the answer is absolutely yes. I just did one very recently for a religious organization in a certain market and it actually stemmed from just by looking at a lot of their materials and a lot of the collateral and things that they were talking about both internally and externally, and realizing that everybody was sort of talking about something different. What do we stand for? What is our purpose? What are we trying to deliver? There was a lot of, I'll say, confusion, or just at least misperceptions around who this organization really was. Who were they trying to serve, and what were they trying to deliver, and what their real purpose was. And I did, and this was sort of more internal than external, but I did a lot of research with folks that ran the organization, employees and members of the board and whatnot, and just doing some initial qualitative research. And the things that I was hearing proved that there was just a lot of uncertainty around what they were. So we put together a process. We came up with a very, very strong brand narrative. We put together some great materials for them. It now, again, it's one of those books. It's actually one of the examples that I showed at the end of the presentation. It sits on every employee's desk that speaks to who they are, what they are. It explains the narrative. It talks about the words to use and the words to not lose. And it's completely transformed all of their internal and external communication. As far as the second question goes, and how do you do this for maybe a not exciting brand, something like a B2B? Look, it's the same process and it's the same principle. The methodology and how you get some of the insights that you need to develop it may be a little bit different. But at the end of the day, a B2B company is still trying to stand for something. There's still a reason why you want your partners and why you want your customers to be dealing with you and doing business with you. And a lot of that goes beyond just some of the functional elements. This might be obviously a little bit more price and delivery or service focused business, but you still want to have a brand that stands for something that gives people a reason beyond that to want to do business with you. And there should be some sort of emotional benefit that they get for knowing that they're doing business with a company like yourself.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. We've pretty much run out of time. It's been illuminating for me, and always a pleasure to listen to you guys talk about this stuff, and super interesting. Again, if you want any more information, you can reach out to Joel or Mitch directly. Their information is still on the screen. The presentation and the entire audio and visual of this will be available for viewing later, and you'll get a link to that. I want to thank everybody for taking their time to join us. And we'll do more of these, and hopefully if you can join us at Brand Manage Camp next year for our 18th annual, you can get all the information online at brandmanagecamp.com. Joel and Mitch, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody that spent their time with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for giving us the time.
Okay. Take care, everybody.